They said she crossed a line, helped a man she shouldn't have, a stranger bleeding out by the corral fence. By sunrise, she was gone. Fired, tossed out like yesterday's dust. But that same morning, when the first light broke over the ridge, the ranch hands froze mid-step. The horizon shimmered with the silhouettes of riders, thousands of them, closing in from every direction. Guns, banners, dust rising like judgment itself. Nobody knew who they were, but everyone knew why they'd come. And it started with the girl they cast away. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The moon sat like a coin pressed into cold leather, bright and unforgiving, and Clara May moved beneath it with the quiet patience of someone whose nights belonged to animals and small mercies. She knew every mote of a saddle, every tremor in a flank, and when she found the man against the corral post, she did not gasp or shout. She simply knelt, as if prayer and practice were the same thing, and felt for a pulse that scarred her palm with heat and desperation. Blood had darkened his coat in a spreading moonflower, and his eyes were open but raw with a plea that needed no name. He was a stranger, no ranch mark, no town stitch, nothing but the ache of a body betrayed. The rules of Elias Boone's place were carved into the beams. No harboring of drifters, no meddling with men who wore trouble like a second skin. Yet Clara's hands moved as if the rules were made of dust you could sweep away. She hauled him inside, beneath the rafters where the hay smelled like summer when the horse's breath warmed the cold, and set to work with needle and thread, with water warmed over the lamp and cloth damp firm. Her fingers were small but sure, the way they had to be. She tied knots that would hold, whispered words that steadied both, and when he flinched she cried without quite knowing she had. A brief sound the horses turned to hear and then ignored. "Hold on," she said into his ear, and it was not bravado. It was the rawest form of insistence. She wrapped him in stale blankets and slid him between bales, then built a half-world of silence around him, a place where curses and suspicion could not find him. The barn settled back into its old noises, hoofbeats on the creak of a chain, but Clara could not return to untangling the reins as if nothing had happened. The heat of his blood clung to her nails. There was a ledger of reasons men like Elias kept. Loyalty to a ranch meant iron discipline, but compassion, she knew, was a ledger no one kept because it complicated things. She thought of her father teaching her to bind a wound by lantern light, his hands trembling with less fear than pride, and of the boy at the general store who once cried when a horse was put down and she had wrapped his palms in straw and said, "It's mercy, not weakness." She sat on a crate and listened to the man breathe, each inhalation a cliff edge she refused to let him fall from. Outside, wind came and went over the plains like a judge shifting its robe. Inside, she worked until the moon leaned thin in the first, bruised suggestion of dawn bled into the east. When she finished, she tucked a scrap of cloth beneath his chin, smoothed the hair from his brow, and tucked a little of herself into the folds, an imprint of faith that was small and stubborn. The hay smelled of resonant hope. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. They trembled because the lines she had crossed felt at once trivial and enormous. She had breached the ranch's iron rules, yes, but she had done what the boy at the store could never do for himself. She had chosen another life over quiet conformity. Somewhere in the dark, a horse snorted as if in approval. Clara let the silence hold them both, an open wound and a healing hand, and understood in the marrow of her bones that this one night would split what came after into before and after. Rules could call her a traitor, the foreman could call her reckless, but when a life lay at her feet, the world reduced to the simple arithmetic of saving or not. In that dim barn, with the moon a witness and the hay a soft tribunal, she stitched not just flesh but the thin, brave thread that would tether choices to consequence, and when she finally rose she left the lantern low and the door cracked, a small mercy, a promise that this secret, for now, would sleep beneath straw and breath. By the time the sun lifted over the far ridge, the smell of hay and gun oil carried whisper sharper than barbed wire. Every hand on Boone's ranch knew something had happened in the stables before dawn. The cook stopped mid-pour, the blacksmith's hammer paused above the anvil, and word rode faster than a Mustang down the line. The stable girl took in a wounded man. Elias Boone found her standing by the water trough, face pale in the morning glare, fingers raw from work she hadn't finished. He moved like a man who measured every step in judgment, boots striking the dust with the rhythm of a gallows drum. Boone's face was a map carved by weather and regret, eyes cold as a creek under frost. He stopped inches from her and said, "You helped an outlaw. That makes you one." No shout, no spectacle, just the sound of iron conviction. The ranch fell silent around them. Clara didn't speak. Her words would be like pouring water on a stone. She knew Boone's type, men who believed mercy made you weak, men who confused survival with righteousness. The horses watched from the corral, twitching nervously, catching the heat that wasn't from the sun. Boone's voice cut again, flat as the cleaver. "You bring sickness into this ranch, girl, and you think you're saving souls? You're a fool or worse." He waited, expecting tears, begging, repentance, but Clara only lowered her eyes and said quietly, "He would have died." Boone's mouth twitched, the closest thing he ever came to flinching. "Then he should have died honest," he said. It was his creed, the rancher's creed. Survival owed nothing to sympathy. When she didn't answer, he turned his gaze toward the bunkhouse where the hands had gathered, their faces small in the light. "You hear that?" he called out. "We don't keep those who bring strangers and secrets here. This land's got no room for soft hearts." His words landed heavy, and no one stepped forward, though a few looked away in shame. Clara's heart felt like a knot pulled tight inside her chest, but she stood still, chin lifted just enough to make his authority feel uncertain. "You're fired," Boone said, final as a gunshot. "No pay, no ride. You walk." A dry wind carried the decree away like ash. Boone turned and left, but his shoulders seemed heavier now, as if the sentence weighed more on him than he'd ever admit. Clara gathered her few things, a threadbare shawl, a pair of gloves, a small knife her father had given her before he died. The ranch hands stayed distant, pretending to fix fences, adjust saddles, clean boots, anything to avoid her eyes. Only young Tommy, Boone's nephew, broke from the line. He jogged up, face flushed, eyes wet. "Miss Clara," he whispered, thrusting a dented canteen into her hands. "You did right. I know you did." His voice cracked, and before she could answer, Boone's bark rang out from the porch. "Tommy." The boy flinched and backed away, leaving her with a full heart and a dry mouth. She slipped the canteen into her satchel, the weight of it absurdly comforting. As she walked past the fence, the horses shifted restlessly. One mare nickered softly, as if sensing goodbye. Clara reached out, brushing her fingers along the animal's mane, the touch saying what words could. The sun climbed higher, the dust shimmering like ghosts rising from the earth. Behind her, Boone stood on the porch, watching until her figure blurred into the heat. His jaw worked, grinding thoughts he'd never speak. Inside him, guilt twisted like an old wound reopened. He'd seen that same look in another's eyes years ago, before the war turned him into something half man, half law. But he turned away, because a man like Elias Boone didn't let himself bleed where others could see. And as Clara disappeared down the long road, the ranch returned to its order, hammers striking, horses snorting, but the air had changed, charged with something invisible and waiting. Boone's code had been upheld, but somewhere deep in the bones of the land, consequence was already stirring. The road stretched like a scar across the open land, a line that divided the known from the forgotten. And Clara May walked it with her head high, though her heart dragged behind like a broken wagon wheel. Each step sent up a puff of red dust that clung to her skirt, her boots, her breath, as if the earth itself wanted to keep her marked. The ranch behind her shrank in the shimmer of dawn, fences thinning into ribs of silver and smoke, and though no words were spoken aloud, she could feel the weight of eyes from the fence line, ranch hands watching, torn between duty and decency, their faces lined with quiet shame. None dared wave, none dared speak. The code of Boone's ranch was silence, and silence had its own cruel language. The wind pushed her hair into her eyes, and she didn't brush it away. She just kept walking, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath her boots, the soft jingle of the canteen Tommy had slipped into her hand. That single act, small and trembling, was a rebellion in itself, a spark of boyish courage that cut through the hard trust of this land. His words still echoed in her head. "You did right, simple, sincere, and dangerous. In a place where mercy was treason." Truth like that could get a boy whipped. She had wanted to tell him not to speak it, not to risk it, but her throat had closed before the words could climb out. Now, alone under the vast and empty sky, Clara let herself feel the thing she'd buried beneath composure, the ache of being cast out not for wrongdoing, but for doing what conscience demanded. The horizon rippled ahead, gold spilling into fire, and every shimmer of heat seemed to mock her. What now? Stable girl with no home, no coin, no place to lay your faith. Still, she kept her pace steady, because the only thing worse than walking away was turning back. Behind her, the ranch hands slowly returned to their tasks. The sound of hammers resumed, the snort of horses filled the air, but the rhythm felt off, hollowed, as though Boone's decree had stripped something invisible from them all. She thought of Boone's eyes when he told her to go, how they'd glinted like cold steel but quivered for just a breath, as though some part of him, long buried under war and weather, had wanted her to disobey. Men like Boone wore their rules like armor because they feared what compassion could unearth. The wind rose again, whipping dust into swirls that blurred the edges of everything, and she saw her shadow stretch long behind her, thin and wavering. It looked fragile, like something about to disappear, but she kept it company anyway, because even shadows needed walking beside. After a mile or so, her throat burned and her steps grew heavier, so she unscrewed the canteen. The water was warm, metallic, but it felt sacred as wine. She took a single sip and whispered, "Thank you, Tommy," as if saying it might carry the words back on the wind. The land around her unfolded in endless amber waves, mesquite, sage, and the low hum of cicadas announcing heat that would soon press down like judgment. Somewhere to her left, a vulture turned lazy circles over a patch of rock. Somewhere ahead, a promise waited, though she couldn't name it yet. Her mind drifted back to the wounded stranger, his face half hidden in the lantern light, his breathing shallow but stubborn, and she wondered if he'd made it through the night. If her defiance had saved a life or just postponed an inevitable death. That thought twisted something deep in her, but she refused to let guilt win. The world didn't need more people who turned away. She walked until her legs trembled and the race was nothing but a mirage dissolving into sunlight. Then she paused, turned once, and looked back, not in longing, but in recognition. The ranch was smaller now, meaner somehow, boxed in by its own walls. She touched the canteen against her heart, felt the rhythm still steady beneath her ribs, and whispered to the horizon, "Let the dust remember me kindly." The wind answered in a low moan, carrying her onward, away from judgment, toward the unknown mercy of whatever waited beyond the next ridge. The barn was a cathedral of silence, shafts of early light slipping through the boards like then, divine fingers, catching in the dust that drifted lazily over straw and blood. In that quiet, the wounded man stirred, a slow twitch of muscle beneath crusted fabric, a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. His name, whatever it had once been, didn't matter here. Names were for men who had a place in the world. He was a ghost of a soldier, bones carved from hardship, skin marred by too many battles fought for the wrong causes. His body protested every movement, yet the memory of her touch, the stable girl's trembling hands, the warmth of her voice as she whispered through fear, pulled him up through the haze. He remembered the sting of a needle pulling his flesh together, the tremor in her breath when she saw how deep the bullet had gone, and the salt of her tears falling against his cheek when he couldn't answer her question, "Who did this to you?" Now, her absence was a hollow wound of its own. The stable smelt of her, sweet hay, faint soap, and something human and unguarded, and when he tried to call out, his throat rasped like sandpaper. He dragged himself toward the open crack of daylight at the barn door, every inch a sermon in pain, every gasp a confession. Beyond, the ranch spread wide and still, fence lines stretching toward a horizon that didn't forgive. He could see men moving, small as ants, their shapes distorted in the shimmer of heat. He pressed his hand to his side and felt the fabric stiff with blood, but under it, something harder, a medallion that had survived where men hadn't. Pulling it free, he stared at the burned insignia, a cracked horseshoe circled by fire, the mark of the Iron Mason cavalry. A brotherhood once sworn to protect the border towns, until greed and betrayal hollowed it out, turning soldiers into marauders and justice into something bought or buried. His jaw clenched until pain shot through his skull. "They'll come," he muttered, voice hoarse, more promise than prophecy. He wasn't sure if it was warning or prayer. His fingers traced the emblem, remembering the day it was seared into his chest, not his pride, but his punishment for questioning an order that cost 50 lives. Boone had been there, a captain back then, leading with cold precision, leaving his men bleeding under the banner of survival. The memory hit him like recoil, sudden and hot. He spat in the dirt, the taste of betrayal sharp as rust. He looked around the stable and saw the traces of her care. Bloody drags, a bucket half filled, a needle left near the lamp, and something shifted inside him. She had saved him without knowing the danger that trailed him, without realizing that saving him was calling down the ghosts of Iron Mesa themselves. He had meant to run, to vanish into the plains, but now that her kindness was etched into his bones, running felt like cowardice. He forced himself to stand, wobbling like a newborn foal, gripping the beam for balance. His breath came shallow but steady, every inhale a reminder that he owed her more than words. Outside, the ranch gleamed with morning light, the fences white and the land stretched gold. But under that beauty lay rot, a man like Boone, who once ordered fire upon his own men, now playing the honest foreman. He wanted to tear down the illusion, to make Boone answer for what he'd done. But first, he had to move, had to warn her. The world beyond the barn was already stirring, birds shrieking in frantic patterns as if the sky itself knew something was coming. He tucked the medallion against his chest, pulled his coat tighter, and whispered to the empty air, "If they see the brand, they'll burn it all." The horses snorted, restless, sensing the tremor of fate moving through the morning light. He stumbled into the open, each step a battle, and though his shadow bent and swayed, it didn't fall. The girl had given him back his breath, and in doing so, she had summoned the storm. The morning settled over the ranch with an airy calm, the kind that stretches thin before a storm, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. The sky was a pale wash of blue, too clean, too silent, and the cattle moved slow through the grass, their tails flicking absently, heads bowed as if listening to something deep underground. The men went about their work in a rhythm too careful, too rehearsed, mending fences that didn't need fixing, tossing feed they didn't mean to scatter, each movement deliberate in its attempt to mask the unease that hung invisible but heavy as smoke. Somewhere beyond the ridges, a bird cried once and was answered by silence. Boone stood near the porch, rifle across his forearm, his thumb tracing the etched initials on the stock, his father's, long dead, carved before the war when men still believed in rules that could save them. His eyes swept the land, from the distant tree line to the dark cut of the river bend, and though there was nothing yet to see, something in the wind made his jaw tighten. It carried the faintest tremor, like distant hooves, or maybe it was memory, whispering of battles he'd rather forget. He spat into the dirt, more habit than disdain, and glanced toward the stables. The girl's absence had left the place feeling hollow, though no one dared say it. Boone's men felt it too, the guilt of letting decency be punished. But the code ruled stronger than conscience here, and no one broke it without consequence. He racked the rifle, the metallic click echoing across the yard, sharp enough to make a few heads turn. "Ain't nothing wrong," he muttered, mostly to himself, but the words rang false in his ears. He'd seen this kind of stillness before ambushes, before betrayal, the kind where nature itself seemed to pause, waiting to see who would draw first blood. He turned toward the bunkhouse, where Tommy sat whittling a scrap of pine, pretending not to watch him. The boy's hands were too restless for the task, and Boone knew why. "You hear something, Uncle?" Tommy asked, eyes flicking to the hills. Boone didn't answer at first. The wind shifted then, sudden and sharp, tugging dust from the ground like something alive. He felt it against his face, warm but edged with warning. "Nothing worth hearing," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. The cattle began to move uneasy, heads lifting, nostrils flaring, the whole herd rippling in agitation. A horse in the corral kicked at its stall, nostrils flared, muscles quivering. Boone's instincts, old and unwelcome, stirred like a ghost rising from the trenches of his past. He lifted his gaze again to the horizon, squinting against the brightness, half expecting to see shapes, riders, maybe, or dust plumes, but there was only emptiness. Still, the sound lingered in the back of his mind, a low hum, a rhythm that didn't belong to the wind. His grip on the rifle tightened. "Keep the stock close to the pens," he ordered suddenly, voice louder than intended. The men hesitated. There was no reason given, but none were needed. Boone didn't spook easy, and that alone was reason enough. They moved quickly, corralling the cattle, exchanging glances that spoke of unspoken fear. Tommy stood frozen by the water trough, eyes wide. "What is it?" he asked, and Boone turned, his expression unreadable. "Just air shifting," he said after a pause, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The air carried more than heat. It carried consequence. Somewhere beyond that horizon, something had started to move, drawn by blood, by memory, by an old betrayal that hadn't finished its work. Boone slung the rifle over his shoulder and walked toward the gate, boots grinding against gravel, a solitary figure etched in the wide stillness. The ranch looked peaceful in the light, but the peace felt borrowed, like a man's heartbeat between the trigger pull and the shot. Boone stopped, tasting dust on his tongue, and murmured to no one, "Storm's coming." The words vanished into the wind, but the land heard, and somewhere out there, thunder began to stir. If you've ridden this far with us, dip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The call came like the crack of a bell at dawn, riders, and for a moment the ranch seemed to stop breathing. Men let tools fall from numb fingers, a bucket dipped and spilled its morning water, and the cattle lifted their heads as if listening to a distant drum. On the horizon something bloomed, a slow, terrible thing, first a shimmer, then a line, then ranks of riders whose silhouettes cut the light into 100 sharp edges. They rode not as a scatter of desperates but in formation, saddles rocking in the same rhythm, dust plumes rising behind them like smoke from a long ago fire. There were no lawmen's stars glinting, no flags of the county, only the deliberate, ancient geometry of vengeance. Men in wide-brimmed hats and long coats, faces narrowed by wind and frost, eyes hard with stories that had been turned to weapons. Boone felt it first in the back of his neck, that old, animal foreboding he'd carried out of other wars, a memory of lines drawn and orders given, of men left on the wrong side of a command. He straightened, fingers tightening on the rifle strap at his shoulder, while Tommy, small, restless Tommy, clung to the hem of his uncle's coat, eyes wide and uncomprehending. The ranch hands spread along the fence as if taking positions they'd never rehearsed. Someone fumbled for the heavy rifles in the tack room. Someone else shut gates with hands that shook, and even the dogs grew silent, ears high, noses working the air as if to send an accusation. As the riders drew nearer, the details surfaced, leather scuffed and stitched, boots worn to the bone, coats mended with the same stubbornness that sews a life together after it's been torn. There was a burned emblem glinting faintly on one man's collar, a circular brand like a horseshoe ringed in flame, and when one rider raised his voice it cut the morning clean. "Elias Boone," he said, the name falling like a verdict. Boone felt each syllable land on him and remembered himself younger, a different man who'd once led men under a banner and made choices that still lived in the marrow of his bones. The riders did not sway. They moved as if pulled by an old letter, debts to settle, wrongs to tally. Among them were grayer heads whose faces looked like canyon walls and younger men whose rage was fresh, hungry as new growth. They rode without fanfare but with patience sharpened by years, and their silence was a kind that filled the air with something the ranch had not felt since darker times, accountability in boots. One of them lifted a ragged flag, no town stamp, no sheriff's seal, only a smoke-dark scar of cloth, and used it like a slow hand to ask for words. The voice that came back, low and steady, asked after the woman who'd been seen tending a wounded man. The stable girl, she saved him? The question hung, equal parts accusation and confession. Faces at the fence turned, some flushing with shame, others rigid with resolve. Men who had watched Clara walk away remembered the look she gave the wounded stranger, something like mercy, something more dangerous than Boone's rules, and in that instant, her absence became a presence so large it seemed to tether the earth. The air wavered with the weight of consequence. What one heart had done, the many would answer for. Boone's mouth went dry. He heard his own name in a voice that knew history, and the ranch, which had tried to keep its ledger tidy by exiling a compassionate hand, now found the past coming back in riotous and dust. Tommy clung tighter, not understanding the emblems or the old wounds, but feeling the pull of a story he'd been too small to read until that day. The story where choices leave marks and marks call out the people who left them. The riders circled once, slow as a turning tide, and the land answered with a kind of hush that held its breath, waiting for the first spark. The horizon had moved, and with it rode a law older than Boone's fence posts, the law of reckoning. Boone stepped forward with the brass binoculars pressed to his face like a man seeking counsel from an old judge, and for a long, 6-second he let the shapes arrange themselves into meaning. The riders tightened into focus, ranks folding into ranks, and the burned emblem on their chests caught the morning and made something in his gut go cold. The circular horseshoe ringed in flame, the same scar he'd seen at the wounded man's throat. His jaw worked, a hard, private motion, and when he lowered the glass his voice left him small and flat. "They're the Iron Mesa Riders." The words fell into the yard heavy as a verdict, and men who had pretended not to notice the tightening sky found themselves listening. "Outlaws," Boone said without saying everything. Former soldiers turned marauders, men who'd learned to trade loyalty for pillage when the payoff outweighed the oath. They were the kind of company you survived by avoiding, the kind of name that closed doors and opened graves. The binoculars swung again in his hands and the memory came back in a rush. Smoke and shouted orders. A field where men had fallen like wheat beneath a scythe. A younger Boone with dirt under his nails and a conscience still soft enough to hurt. He saw, in the twitch of a rider's shoulder, a ghost of a past he had tried to nail shut behind him, of choices made in the gray between law and survival. The emblem was not just a brand, it was an accusation. An old ledger reopened. Around him, the ranch hands shifted, their movements smaller, cropped like animals sensing a predator. Some paled, some clenched their teeth, because the name Iron Mesa carried stories the fathers traded in whispers at saloons. Stories of brothers turned to bandits when the paymaster never came, of captains who signed their men's fate with an order and walked away. Tommy's hand grabbed Boone's sleeve, his fingers wide as the wood grain, and the boy's eyes, too young to have learned how to hide fear, asked what the grown men did not voice. Boone found himself answering not to the boy but to the past that had braided itself into the present. They were cavalry once. Then it went bad. The riders continued to close like a shadow folding over a field, their horses' hooves lifting clouds that swallowed the light. Helmets were absent, replaced by hats and kerchiefs, faces hardened by sun and old hurts. And where a town sheriff might carry a badge, these men wore the brand of a unit betrayed by its own. The leader sat pallor in the saddle, a threadbare bandana over his throat and something like grief in the set of his shoulders. And there was a moment when Boone saw the grief and understood it, knew the arithmetic of loss, who could name the exact number of men who'd been left because someone else decided the risk wasn't worth the rescue. He felt the wounded man's medallion press cold against the inside of his breast like an indictment. The ranch, which had kept rules to keep itself whole, now found those rules brittle as old bone. What had been an edict against harboring drifters had become a brittle dam against a tide that remembered names and debts. Men whispered, half-formed questions that scattered like birds, but no hand reached for a rifle until the riders came within earshot, and then everything sharpened, the metallic rattle of tack, the distant bark of a hound, a wind that smelled like iron. Boone's throat moved. He did not smooth the lie, because there was no lie left that would hold. "They're looking for a man," one rider called out across the widening space, voice carrying like a stone thrown into a pool, and it hit Boone with the force of a confession. Faces at the fence dropped, some with guilt, others with sudden, ragged fear. He thought of the sentence he had delivered the night before, simple, decisive, "You're fired. Leave." He saw Clara's small figure walking the road, the way her shoulders bore the light, and a bitterness rose in him, the taste of cinder on the tongue. The knowledge that his past and his present were colliding into a future none of them had chosen pressed down on him like the weight of a roof about to fall. The Iron Mason Riders were not a rumor anymore. They were a law in boots, and the ranch that had tried to discipline compassion out of its people now stood exposed, a ledger with more blanks than entries. Boone turned slowly, the binoculars dangling from one hand, and for the first time in years he felt the raw, animal understanding that there are debts the earth does not bury. They come back with riders and dust, and they call your name. The bunkhouse breathes a sour warmth of men and old smoke, boots lined like tired soldiers beneath iron cots, blankets half-kicked. the air still humming with the last shift of nerves from the shouted word, "Riders," and Tommy slipped inside like a secret, small and quick, eyes darting toward the window where dust smeared the morning into a bruise. He wasn't supposed to be there, not when the yard bristled with rifles and orders, but something tugged him, memory, guilt, the shape of Clara's absence hanging in the doorway of his heart. So he went to the peg where her things had hung, the space naked as a grave, and dropped to a knee by the trunk she'd left behind. Old oak split on one corner like it had taken a bullet for someone. He worked the latch with fingers that remembered making bows from corn husks and now fumbled with bigger storms. The lid rasped open, and there it was, her satchel, canvas worn smooth where her palm had always settled, the strap stitched twice where it had frayed. He lifted it as if it were alive, and it was, alive with everything she hadn't said when they fired her, alive with the soft clink of a tin cup and the paper whisper of something folded too carefully to be anything but important. He eased the flap back and found the letter wrapped in oilcloth, edges frayed, the seal pressed into dark wax like an eye that still watched. The insignia hit him like a brand to the mind, the rained horseshoe, fire licking its edges, the same mark Boone had named and feared, the same mark burned into the rioters coming over the horizon. Tommy's breath shortened, chest a bellows feeding panic, and he worked the wax loose with his thumbnail until it broke like brittle bone. Inside, the paper smelled of sweat and iron in the road. The handwriting was careful but ragged, letters that tried to stand up straight while the ground pitched beneath them. To any soul with a spine left, to the ranch that keeps a foreman named Boone. The iron mace is not whole, not true. Men I called brothers turned their coats when they were promised land by a snake who wore a captain's bars once. There's a reckoning rolling and I'm trying to break it, not lead it. If Boone's still breathing out there, tell him he left us dead in the border cut, and the ones who crawled back decided justice had to be paid in kind. Don't let them touch a woman or a child. I'll take the brand if it means I can steer the fire around the innocent. If I don't make it, tell whoever reads this the truth. I ain't running from Iron Mesa. I'm running ahead of it, trying to slow it, trying to drag it into daylight. The words lifted off the page like heat, and in their wake Tommy saw the wounded man again. How his face had been gray as the belly of a storm. How Clara had crouched beside him with needle and thread in that stubborn quiet that made men uncomfortable because it made them remember their own best selves. The missing piece slid into place with a click he felt in his bones. The man wasn't fleeing from devils. He'd come to earn the living. He wasn't running from them. Tommy breathed, voice finding itself in the hush of the bunkhouse. He was one of them, and he was trying to stop them. The sentence hung like a lantern suddenly lit, throwing shadows into corners that had been happy to pretend they were empty. He pictured Clara's eyes when Boone called her a fool, the way she didn't flinch because her truth wasn't for sale. He pictured her walking the road alone, carrying this secret like a coal in her pocket, hot enough to burn but too precious to drop. The bunkhouse boards creaked as the wind pressed a palm against the wall, and outside the ranch kept bracing for a fight it didn't understand. Tommy folded the letter back, hands steadier now, because a story with a villain is easy but one with a wounded messenger, that takes courage. He slipped the letter into his shirt, close enough to feel its beat, and straightened. Boy small but soul tall, and in that moment he decided two things. He would find Clara and he would make Boone read every word. The world beyond the window ran with dust and danger, but the truth had a saddle now, and Tommy meant to ride it straight into the storm. The first shot cracked like a verdict and everything that had been held taut in the yard snapped. Silence that had been waiting for permission to break surrendered to a sound that split the morning open, and for a breathless heartbeat every man on the ranch went still as if listening to a coffin lid close. The report came from the direction of the riders, a single bark that might have been warning or malice, and then another, staccato and answering, until the air tasted of hot metal and the sky seemed to tilt. Men dug behind barrels and stacks of feed, the dogs flattened their bodies against the porch, and the cattle bolted in a panic ribbon of flesh and hooves, stamping dust into a blind that swallowed outlines. Boone felt the rifle leap into his hands like a remembered prayer. Years of muscle memory unfolded in his grip, shoulder, sight, breath, and yet his heart hammered a rhythm he hadn't allowed in years. The riders had formed a ring now, intentional and patient, a slow tightening that turned the ranch into an island. One of them raised his arm and let a shot sing over the heads of the men in the yard, a line across the sky that meant business. You have time to speak, and then you will have nothing. Tommy crouched behind a bale, knuckles white where they gripped the rough twine, and the letter burned like a coal against his sternum, a secret that had turned into a fuse. "Stay low," Boone barked, voice rough as gravel, and in the same breath he heard himself give orders that felt borrowed from another life he had tried to bury. "Mandy Westgate, keep the horses calm. Don't show your face." The ranch hands scrambled, shaking but obedient. Discipline lived in muscle memory too, and someone slammed the barn doors shut, a metallic clang that echoed like a finality. The riders answered with a volley that sent splinters from the fencing, a plank shredded, posting fragments like paper confessions. The air filled with a bitter tang of fear and gun smoke, and in that chemical honesty the faces of the men rearranged into something more real than the etiquette of work. Fear, shame, resolve, a stubbornness scraped raw. Clara was not there. She had been cast out with a single word, and yet the consequences of her mercy now braided themselves into the sound of bullets. From the ridge, a rider's voice called across the yard, low and steady, "We want Boone. He'll come out, and we settle scores proper." There was no negotiation in it, only an old demand carried like a ledger. Boone stepped into view on the porch, rifle lowered but not harmless, his jaw set, the map of his past drawn in furrows around his mouth. He felt suddenly the weight of every decision that had led him to that plank of wood and nail, decisions made under different suns, with different names, that had left men to die and now had men returning with slow, surgical purpose. His mouth moved, and words came that were more rhythmic than speech. "You'll not take the ranch," he said. The leader's reply was a single name, one word that slammed into Boone like a hammer: justice. For an instant hands froze again, because justice in the mouths of those who had been betrayed sounded like thunder, and the thunder wanted payment. A shot cracked the dirt near the gate, a warning so close it kicked grit into faces, and something like a collective animal instinct rose in the yard: fight or surrender, and neither option felt clean. Tommy wanted to run into the open, to find Clara or to shout the truth of the letter, but fear pinned him to a bale. Instead he rubbed his palm over the paper in his shirt until the edges blurred, as if he could smudge away the need for blood. The wounded man, somewhere under a blanket in the barn, breathed shallow and cursed himself for being a map that led men to a place where bullets would find roots. The riders advanced a step, a measured turn that felt like the tightening of a noose, and the leader's voice asked again for Boone to step forward and answer for old sins. In that space Boone felt the thin thread that held his life and the ranch together fray. He saw Clara's receding back in the dust and wondered whether mercy ever got to sleep under the same roof as consequence. He imagined the faces of the men he'd once commanded, boys who trusted him to bring them home, and the memory cut him sharper than any pellet. "I'll step down," he said finally, voice small against the morning, and the yard inhaled as if expecting the fall of a curtain. In the hush that followed, the first real choice of the day took shape: to hand himself over and let others brand the ledger, or to hold his post and risk everything on a stubborn, brittle code. Outside, the riders lifted their hats once, not in civility but in an acknowledgement that a reckoning had come to a place that thought it could fence out the past. The first shot had opened the ledger. Now all that remained was how they would write the entry. Dust rose off the ridge like a rumor, and then, against that trembling heat, a figure resolved itself. A woman small against the sky, hair wrapped in a scarf, boots heavy with travel, and Claire rode down the slope leading a stray horse that had come to trust the steadiness of her hand. She had been walking the long road until the first sharp crack of gunfire slashed across the plain, and something in her chest refused the easy path of silence, the path she had been forced onto by Boone's sentence, and so she turned her back on the road she had planned and followed the thread of noise like a moth to flame. Her hands smelled of saddle leather and smoke and the faint iron tang of worry. The animal beside her nudged her shoulder as if to say, "Keep going," and she tightened her grip and let the horse pick its own rhythm, hooves thudding a careful measure over rock and scrub. She had time enough to rehearse cowardice, stay gone, find work in another town, but the sound of men answering men with gunfire was something that severed rehearsals. It called her, demanded witness. She had not come for triumph or to face Boone with accusations fitted neat as a tailor's coat. She had come for truth, the thing that had lodged under her ribs the night she chose to bind a stranger's wound. The truth felt like a bitter coin in her mouth, uncertain in value, dangerous to swallow, but hers to spend. As she crested a slight rise, the ranch lay spread below like a small, wounded animal. Smoke threaded the air. Riders ringed the yard in slow, patient motion, and figures darted behind barrels and feed like mice at the edge of a barn's belly. Tommy stood at the fence, face white and eager, with the look of a child who has seen a saint and a scoundrel in the same hour. When he glimpsed her, his mouth opened and closed like he had been given a secret and was in the act of deciding whether to keep it. Clara guided the horse down the slope, hands steady. Her heart thumped as if it would leap from her throat. The animal's breath steamed in the chill of early violence, and she felt, absurdly, the same calm she'd held over the wounded man's body the night before, that small insistence that hands are for healing before they are for harm. The riders watched her approach with a measured stillness, hats tipped low, eyes like gravel. One of them shifted and the circle tightened almost imperceptibly. Boone's silhouette stood on the porch, broader, shorter, older, and when their eyes met for a fraction, he saw in her the thing he'd punished, compassion unbowed. For a beat the world held, as if the land itself paused to read the line between what had been and what would be. She dismounted with the practiced motion of someone whose life was measured in bridles and buckets, barefoot, toed boots finding dust with a familiarity that comforted her. Around her the ranch thrummed with a kind of fear that smelled like gunpowder and old regrets. Men glanced at her as if waiting for a verdict they had already decided to convict. Clara didn't hurry. She walked a short distance to the barn, a woman who had once been ordered out and was now walking back into the teeth of consequence with nothing but a will and the memory of a hand she could not refuse to save. The horse nickered softly and noticed the hem of her skirt. She stroked its neck and thought of the wounded man's face when she'd sewn him, of the way his eyes had softened at the touch of a stranger's care. That memory had weighed enough to change the shape of a person. She heard someone call her name, Tommy, high and hopeful, and answered with a small nod that felt like a confession. Around her, men adjusted rifles and faces, and Boone's jaw worked as if chewing on questions he had not expected to be asked aloud. Clara's steps were slow so that everyone could see she carried nothing hidden, no weapon, no intent to inflame the situation, only the plainness of a woman who does what she believes is right and will bear whatever that brings. She thought of her father's hands, of the seam of his life stitched with small mercies, and let that memory armor her more than any gun could. She stood in the light and looked toward the riders and then back at the barn where, hidden in straw and shadow, a wounded man might yet breathe because of what she had done. The fact of that possibility steadied her more than fear ever could. "I didn't run," she might have said aloud, or might not. Words were thin things against the firm beat of boots, but her presence spoke. Truth, not vengeance, had brought her back. The ridge behind her held the road she'd left, thin as a promise. "I had." The ranch held its breath, the day ready to decide whether mercy could have a place among old debts or whether the ledger would be kept, whatever the cost. If you've ridden this far with us, dip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The gunfire thinned into ragged echoes and, for a breath, the world seemed to hold its own blood. In that suspended hush, a ranch hand who'd been flattening himself behind a feed barrel coughed, his face gone the color of old linen, and with a last, ragged strength pointed a shaking finger at the barn as if it'd seen the shape of fate itself. Clara moved as though pulled by a rope tied to a promise, quick, close to the ground at first to avoid the stray splinters still ricocheting in the yard, then straightening as she pushed through the barn door and the smell of hay and iron and her own choice wrapped around her like a cloak. Inside, light slivered through the boards in thin knives, cutting the dust motes into a slow, suspended storm. The man she had tucked beneath straw in a night's mercy lay partly unrolled, his breath the barest whisper against the hush, his face pale as a page and softer in the dark than the rumor of his past. He opened his eyes and for a fraction Clara could see the rawness of recognition, how he had been held and not thrown away, and his fingers found hers like a sailor finding rope. He coughed and the sound scraped like gravel. Clara and Elton felt the heat of him under layers. The bullets placed a small, angry map beneath his ribs. She had come to the yard for truth, and now truth sat on a bale and tasted like iron. He pressed something into her palm, a medallion, warm and heavy, and his lips moved before he had the breath for speech. "They're not here for the land," he rasped, voice the refuse of a man given back to waking. "They're here for Boone." His meaning landed like a stone in Clara's stomach. All the neat edges of blame and order she'd been given dissolved into a darker ledger. Boone's face had been the ranch's law, but this man's hand trembled not with greed but with a confession. Years ago, in a border cut that smelled of dust and smoke, orders had been given, orders that left men to die while others walked away with rank and clean coats. The medallion bore the burned ring of iron mesa and the name that hooked the past to the present. The wounded soldier coughed again and, with the last of his strength, threatened his confession between gasps. "He left us," the man said, eyes going glassy with remembered night. "Boone signed our names away when the captain took coin and promised land. We crawled back a few. We swore we'd not let our dead be lies." The words fell into the hay like seeds, ugly and inevitable. Clara's hands did not tremble now. They held the coin as if it was a key. She thought of the ledger Boone had kept in his mind: discipline, order, the hard calculus of survival, and of the way that ledger refused to tally the small mercies that turned a person whole again. They wanted him, the men whispered, and his breath hitched like the last stitch of a seam. Justice, not blood. They'll take what's sowed. Not blood? Clara's voice was small against the barn's ribs, but something in it threatened out, a question and a plea. He coughed and showed her a small, tender mercy in his eyes. "We won't be killers for sport. We're tired of being left. We want Boone," answered the ledger. Outside, the riders tightened their ring and the earth itself seemed to lean in, drawn to the shape of the confession. The wounded man's fingers slackened in hers. He tried to form another sentence and instead laughed, a short sound like someone surprised at kindness. "You did right," he said, not to Boone but to the girl who had seen a human and not a threat. "You'd have saved me or killed me clean. Either way, you were brave." Clara felt a surge that was not triumph but hollow gratitude, the kind a person keeps when a life is returned only to hand it over to consequence. She wanted to tell him she'd do it all again, stitch and hide and risk another firing, and for a moment words rose like a tide and fell unsaid. The man's breath thinned. He pressed the medallion to his chest as if to stitch himself whole with memory, and then, with a soft, ragged sigh, he closed his eyes. Clara held him a second longer, feeling the weight of the deed like a coal in her palm, hot, alive, dangerous. She stood and pinned the medallion inside her bodice, the brand of iron mesa, a seer she'd not chosen but would now carry into daylight. The barn door creaked as wind found its seam, and the world outside surged back. The riders lowered their reins. Boone's jaw worked like a man chewing on a future he hadn't planned to swallow, and Tommy's small shape hovered, the letter heavy in his shirt. Justice, the wounded man had said, not blood. Yet Clara knew truths had a way of changing hands, turning soft pleas into hard reckonings. She walked out of the barn with the night's secret pressed close and understood that Mercy had opened the ledger that would now be read aloud in the dust. Flames licked the corral rails like a slow, hungry animal, black smoke reeking into the morning as if the land itself were mourning. And Clara walked through the heat with her skirts dust stiff and her jaw set, every step a sentence. She had come back for truth, not spectacle, but the truth was wearing a blaze, and Boone stood between it and the rest of the ranch as though he could swallow confession whole. The men moved around them like bones settling, hands on rifles, faces drawn, Tommy hovering at the edge with the letter clutched like a relic. And when Clara reached the porch, she did not lower her eyes. She looked at Elias Boone, the man who had measured mercy against profit and found mercy wanting, and said, her voice steady as a needle pulling thread, "You said helping a dying man was wrong. What do you call leaving 50 behind?" The words struck him like a thrown knife. Boone's face, mapped by years and weather, shifted. For the briefest moment, something tender and terrible flickered through him. Regret, maybe, or a memory so sharp it hurt to hold. He spat into the dirt, the dust smoking where it met the droplet, and answered in the tone of a man wrapped too long in the armor of his own principles. War makes choices. You wouldn't understand. It was not accusation but justification, an old wound kept bandaged beneath callous reason. Clara's hands tightened on the medallion beneath her bodice, the iron mesa brand searing faintly against her ribs, and she thought of the wounded man's letter folded inside Tommy's shirt, that plea written by hands that had trembled for truth. The words on that page had turned her act of mercy into a summons for judgment. She had been called soft, foolish, dangerous, names meant to shrink her, but she did not feel small now. "I do understand," she said, not loud, but clear enough to slice through the smoke. I understand the weight of choosing to save one life when the ledger demands numbers. I understand that a man who walks away from his own wears a coat stitched with cowardice. Around them, a horse reared, screaming into the haze, and the corral's wood gave a wet shudder as a burst of flame kissed the dry grain. Men scrambled, some for buckets, others for shelter, while Tommy stood frozen, his boyish face tight with dawning courage. Boone's jaw worked. Pride was a poor bandage for guilt, and you could see the seams splitting. He squared his shoulders, lifting a rifle that suddenly looked too heavy for the man he was pretending to be. You don't know the orders that were given, he said, as though orders were currency enough to buy forgiveness. You don't know how lines must be held. Clara let the wind take her breath, tasting smoke and iron, the raw truth of men who mistake cruelty for leadership. Lines? She echoed. Those men died on a line because some captain thought coin and land were worth more than loyalty. You called that necessary then. You call my mercy a crime now. Her words peeled him open, stitch by stitch. The stories that had long lived in saloons and whispers moved into daylight, names the writers had come to balance, names Boone had never expected to hear again. The horses stamped, a dog barked twice, sharp and nervous, echoing the tension. Boone's mouth twisted, anger curdled with shame. War makes choices, he repeated, louder this time, as though repetition could turn cowardice into creed. You were never in the war, Clara laughed once, a small, dry sound, sorrow wearing the mask of disbelief. You make it sound like that settles things, she said. But choices are debts, Elias. They don't die because you stop counting. The riders watched from their circle of dust, faces unreadable but their silence heavy with judgment. The leader shifted in the saddle, the posture of a man weighing truth against retribution, and the ranch, once tidy in its cruelty, now stood exposed, its mortal bookkeeping scattered to the wind. The men on the porch stared at Boone, searching for the man they trusted. Some saw a leader, others only a soldier hiding behind excuses. Then Tommy stepped forward, voice trembling but strong. Uncle, he said, what if saving one man saves more than you think? The question fell like rain on drought-hardened earth. The wind stopped, and the world held its breath. Boone closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment Clara saw the boy he must have been, mud on his boots, a hand slipping from his grasp, silence pressing on him like a verdict. When he opened them again, there was no absolution, only understanding. He lowered the rifle slowly, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of what he could no longer deny. Behind him, the riders did not surge, they waited, patient as fate itself. Clara stood in the ash-flecked light, the medallion burning against her heart, and knew that compassion had cost her a home but bought her something worth far more, the courage to speak truth into fire. The corral burned and the day held still, and for the first, Clara stepped out between the gun lines like someone walking into a confession, unarmed and small against the circle of rifles, the wind tugging at her scarf as if trying to pry the words from her mouth before she had a chance to speak. For a breath the world narrowed to the clink of metal, the soft rasp of leather, and the sound of her own boots on sun-brittle earth, and then she raised her head and let the truth fall. Not like a whip but like a slow, persistent tide that reshapes whatever it reaches. She told them who the wounded man had been, not as a flourish but as fact, a soldier once, branded by Iron Mesa, who had come to their gate with a medallion and a plea, who had tried to unthread the very thing that had made him guilty in his brother's eyes. She spoke of the border cut where orders had been given and men had been left to burn like dunder while promises of land and reward were dealt in back rooms. She spoke of a captain's coin and a list of names buried in the dust, of lives that had been balanced against ledger lines, and she watched as the leader's jaw tightened with each syllable, as grief pooled in his eyes like rain behind glass. Clara did not point fingers for the sake of spectacle. She listed the small facts with the clarity of someone naming bones at a funeral. The medallion's brand, the torn letter tucked in oilcloth, the man's attempt to steer the riders away from innocence by taking on their shame. She told them how she had seen him gape for breath in a barn that smelled of hay and stitching, and how she had chosen not to let him die in the dark. She held nothing back because silence had made the ranch into a place that traded mercy for order, and she had no taste for ledgers that cost lives. The riders listened as if the words themselves were ammunition. Some flinched, others went statue still, and the leader, A man whose face was a map of hard roads, kept his reins quietly loose while his gaze flicked between her and the porch where Boone stood like an accused figure on a bench. Her voice threaded the yard, steady, the cadence of someone who had stitched wounds and now intended to stitch a truth. He didn't come to run. He came to stop what we became. He tried to slow it down, told us we were better than the man who sold our names. She spoke of Boone too, not to excuse or to damn without cause, but to unhook a deeper history from the present. How the foreman had once been a captain, how choices were made in smoke and fear, and how those choices had left a tally no apology could balance. The leader's eyes glassed with lust, and not at the mention of his comrades' deaths, but at the recognition that men could be broken by the same things that made them leaders. Somewhere in the quiet between her sentences, something inside him fractured, an old grief that bullets had never touched, because bullets speak only to the body and not the conscience. He swallowed, and for the first time since he'd taken the ridge that morning his voice softened. "We wanted Boone," he said, but it was not the roar of an executioner. It sounded more like a man reading the back of a shrapnel-burned letter. Around them men shifted, the younger ones with raw edges of anger, the older with the weary knowledge that revenge can eat the soul it's meant to feed, and Clara watched faces that once might have spat at her now tilt, listening as if to a prayer. She told them, too, of the children she'd seen in town, of the mothers who stitched shirts without knowing the names of those who'd fallen, of how a ranch built on silence is a house that will catch fire when the sparks finally find dry wood. Her words pried at something the riders had kept under lash for years, a need for justice that wanted right more than blood, and the leader's shoulders sagged as if the admission of truth had taken too enough. He looked at Boone, and for a second the whole yard held its breath as if reading the margin of the will. Clara's courage was quiet, but it landed like law. There are wrongs that cannot be washed with bullets. There are ledgers that demand voids. When she finished, the wind died down as if the land were listening, and the leader dismounted slowly, boots thudding a careful metronome. He did not raise his gun. He did not call for blood. Instead, he let the grief he carried show, old and human, and in that, something shifted. The day did not end in a blind fury, but in the possibility of an accounting that might bend toward repair. Clara stood with her heart like a small, stubborn lantern, and for the first time in a long time, the ranch brimmed with an uneasy hope that truth, once spoken into the wide plain, could change the shape of consequence. The yard watched like a held breath as Elias Boone stepped off the porch with a slow, reluctant dignity that made every man there remember he was once the kind of leader who could make a body obey without rage. He walked as if moving through memory, rifle cradled in both hands, more out of habit than hope, and each footfall sounded like a reckoning being counted out on the dry ground. Around him, faces softened and hardened in the same blink, some because they could finally look at the man who had given the orders that left men to die, others because they had to see him as the only person who could answer for those orders. Clara stood near the barn, dust and ash settling on the hem of her skirt, the medallion heavy and hot beneath her hand, and watched Boone approach with an odd, intimate sorrow that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the cost a life pays for the decisions of another. The riders closed like a ring of slow tides, their horses stamping and breathing in the same measured rhythm. And at the center of that quiet, the leader watched Boone with a face hammered by loss and patience. He did not look like a man bent on blood, but like someone who had carried a ledger for years and only now intended to reconcile it in daylight. Boone stopped several paces from the leader, set the rifle down in the dust with a clatter that sounded like a verdict, and then, as if finishing a sentence long rehearsed in sleepless nights, he lifted his head and said, "I did what I thought was right." The words were not a plea or a boast, but a small, brittle truth, an offering to the plain fact that decisions had consequences. For a moment no one moved. The air seemed to hold its breath, dust motes frozen in a shaft of sun, as if the world had paused to mark the occasion of a man finally naming his past. The leader looked at Boone, jaw tight, eyes that had watched friends fall and had watched pain breed violence in the name of justice. He did not shout or reach for a noose. He simply inclined his head once, a slow, solemn nod that felt less like mercy and more like acceptance of the ledger being made whole. The riders around him made no move toward vengeance. In their faces there was a tired, terrible gravity, men who had learned the hard arithmetic of loss and who wanted accounting more than slaughter. Boone did not kneel, did not beg. He let the moment land on him like a verdict and then allowed himself to be guided, hands behind his back, toward the riders. They bound him with rough, Competent speed, not a punishment so much as a necessary measure, restraint for a man about to face the truth he'd wrought. Tommy watched from the fence, eyes wide and wet, and Clara felt something shift inside her, a strange relief braided with sorrow, as if the taking of Boone might begin to unstop the places that had been poisoned by silence. Around them, the fire that had fed on corral wood and dry hay began to die, the wind finding the embers and carrying them off like sighs. Men with water and blankets moved quietly, not because they were pleased but because the business at hand had moved from rage to reckoning. The leader spoke then, slow and deliberate, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who'd learned to measure pain. "We didn't come for blood," he said, the phrase more statement than negotiation. "We came to set the ledger straight." Boone did not flinch. He had spent years in places where the ledger was written in graves, and he knew now in a marrow-deep way that answers sometimes demand being given rather than taken. The riders tightened their circle for a heartbeat as if to say the work was not done, then loosened. They were not executioners but carriers of consequence. Someone, an older rider whose face held the soft corrosion of too many winters, helped Boone into a saddle not as a mockery but as a somber courtesy, and when the man was led away in the quiet that followed, there was no cheer, only the low murmur of lives rearranging. Clara stood in the ash-flecked light, the medallion at her heart, and understood the strange economy of what had happened. Mercy had cost her a home but had also opened a way for truth to be heard where silence had formerly ruled. The ranch would be scarred, the corral would need rebuilding, and men would have to reckon with choices they had made or followed. Yet as the riders lifted their heads and their horses turned to the trail, dust rising in patient columns, there was a thin, hopeful ache in the air, a sense that sometimes surrender, not bullets, lets a community begin to stitch itself back together. Tommy ran a few steps, then stopped, watching the riders recede until they were small as punctuation on the horizon. Clara lowered her hand from the medallion, thumb tracing the burn like a palm on scripture, and felt, for the first time since the moonlit night in the stable, that the truth she had chosen to hold might yet be a kind of salvation, not neat, not without loss, but honest. Dawn came soft and slow, a pale ribbon of light that unspooled itself over the burnt rails and the trampled earth as if the world were testing whether it still remembered how to be gentle. Clara stood where the smoke thinned into morning and felt the hush settle like a hand on her shoulder, heavy with ash, light with possibility. The riders had lifted like a shadowed tide and gone, leaving only the language of their passage, hoofs scored in parallel like tally marks, dust columns dwindling to thin ghosts that drew the eye west, the direction of whatever reckonings they were taking with them. Those tracks could lead to redemption, hauling conscience behind them like a harness, or to ruin, dragging vengeance by a rope until it choked the rider who carried it. Around the charred corral the land smelled of wet wood and old iron and something that might be called mercy in a tongue not given to such names, and the ranch stood scarred but stubborn, boards blackened, posts bowed, yet still rising from the hurt as a town's spine will when a storm passes through. Clara's skirt was rimed with ash, her hands still kept the faint clinch of the medallion against her heart, and for a long, private moment she simply watched the horizon, the way the light broke and poured over the plain like a river finding its bed again. Tommy came up silent as a question, breath coming quick with boyhood urgency, eyes large and honest in a face that had been made to look old by witnessing things none should have to see. He stood beside her at the fence, boots scuffed, shirt dusty, holding a small, foolish courage that both frightened and pleased her. He didn't speak at once, the kind of quiet that settles after a sentence too heavy for sound. But when he did, his voice was almost a whisper. "Do you think it'll change things?" Clara turned to him, and the smile that came was small and honest and older than the day, the sort of smile that has learned the price of truth yet offers it anyway. "Sometimes saving one life saves them all," she said, and the words sat between them like a noose, simple and impossible, because she had seen it in the roundness of a rescued breath, in the way a single kindness can ripple outward, softening edges that once seemed set in iron. They walked the perimeter where the smoke still curled, picking their way past half-melted buckets and a broken pitchfork that jutted from the dirt like a verdict. Men were already at work, not with triumphant haste but with the slow, necessary motions of repair, mending fence, hauling ash away, whispering names and debts into the sun so they could be carried off with the wind instead of kept to rot inside. Boone's porch was empty. His shadow lingered in the doorway like a memory, and Clara felt no triumph at that absence, only a weary relief that a reckoning had been faced, not granted, but faced. The riders had taken him with them as one of the ledger's entries, not as an execution, and there was something salvational in that choice. Justice, when it comes breathing, is often more complex than the simpler stories we tell ourselves at night. Around them the animals returned, horses nudging at mended halters, a dog nosing through scattered straw, and their normalcy felt like prayer, life insisting on its messy continuance despite what men had done. Tommy found the torn oilcloth letter folded into his shirt and handed it back to Clara as if the paper itself might still tremble. She smoothed the crease with fingers that bore the calluses of tending, of doing small mercies, and read the jagged handwriting once more, feeling the weight of names and promises and the brittle hope that people can choose better when given a chance. When she finished, she folded the note into a pocket and looked toward the trail the riders had taken, where dust columns dimmed into gray, and she let herself believe, hold as carefully as one might hold a sleeping child, that this morning could be different. The camera, if there were one to capture the scene, might linger on her silhouette as the sun rose bigger and cleaner, washing the ash and the blood into a palette that made forgiveness visible, not cheap, not sudden, but earned by confession and courage in the auto-arithmetic of a single act of mercy that multiplied into more. Tommy slipped his hand into hers, small and warm, and for a moment the world narrowed to that soft grip. Clara whispered again, quieter to the wind than to Winnie air, "We started it right." The smoke end, the birds returned to their noisy gossip in the treetops, and the ranch, though marked, stood ready to be rebuilt with hands that might now count kindness as well as survival. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your half dipped to the past and your heart pointed west.